In 1843, a wagon train left Independence, Missouri, with 120 families and enough flour to last 5 months. By the time they crossed the Blue Mountains, they were boiling rawhide to survive. The recipes that kept those families alive were not written in cookbooks. They were scratched into the margins of Bibles, traded between women at river crossings, and memorized by daughters who watched their mothers cook over buffalo chip fires. Number 14 on this list fed more homesteaders than any government ration. Number 7 was so effective, the U.S. Army copied it. And number 3 uses a preservation method that modern food scientists say outperforms anything on a grocery store shelf. These 20 recipes built a nation, and we forgot every one of them. Before we start, hit that subscribe button because these lost recipes might just change how you think about food forever. Let us count them down. Number 20, hardtack, the bread that refused to die, anchored every pioneer journey west of the Mississippi. Women mixed flour, water, and a pinch of salt into a stiff dough, rolled it flat, pricked it with a fork, and baked it in a Dutch oven until every trace of moisture was gone. The result was a cracker so hard you could crack a tooth on it, pale and dense as a shingle. Emigrants on the Oregon Trail packed barrels of it, knowing that hardtack baked in April would still be edible come October if kept dry. A 50-pound sack of flour cost about $2 in 1850, and from that, a woman could produce enough hardtack to sustain a family for weeks. Children gnawed on it like teething rings. Fathers soaked it in coffee until soft enough to chew, and mothers crumbled it into stews to stretch a thin broth into something filling. Civil War soldiers called it sheet iron and worm castle, but they survived on it all the same. The genius was in what it lacked. No fat, no sugar, no eggs. Nothing to spoil. Hardtack was not food you craved, it was food you lived on. For the tens of thousands who walked beside their wagons across open prairie, it was the difference between arriving and not arriving at all. Number 19, Johnny cake. When wheat flour ran out, and it always ran out, pioneer women turned to what the land offered. Cornmeal, traded from native peoples or ground at the nearest grist mill, became the backbone of the frontier table. Johnny cake was the simplest answer. Cornmeal, a pinch of salt, a splash of water, or milk if you had it, mixed into a batter and cooked on a greased skillet over open coals. The edges crisped golden, while the center stayed dense and slightly sweet from the natural sugars in the corn. Families heading down the wilderness road into Kentucky carried sacks of cornmeal strapped to pack mules, knowing that Johnny cake could be made anywhere a fire could be lit. A bushel of corn cost about 50 cents in 1840. Ground into meal, it fed a family of 6 for a month. Some women added a spoonful of lard for richness or a drizzle of sorghum molasses for sweetness. But the basic Johnny cake needed nothing except heat and hunger. It traveled in saddlebags, wrapped in cloth, eaten cold on the trail or warm beside a campfire. Johnny cake kept the Appalachian frontier alive before wheat ever took root in American soil. Number 18, son of a gun stew. Out on the cattle drives that moved longhorns from Texas to the railheads of Kansas, the chuckwagon cook had one job: keep the cowboys fed and keep them moving. Son of a gun stew was his masterpiece. When a calf was slaughtered, the cook used everything: heart, tongue, liver, sweetbreads, marrow gut, and the partially digested milk from the stomach of an unweaned calf, which gave the stew a tangy richness that no spice could replicate. All of it went into the pot with onions, potatoes if he had them, and enough water to cover. It simmered for hours over mesquite coals, filling the camp with a smell that brought men in from miles of open range. A trail cook who could make a good son of a gun stew was worth his weight in gold dust. The cowboys called it by rougher names, but they lined up for seconds. Every cut that a city butcher would throw away became flavor in that pot. The stew fed 12 men for the cost of one animal. It was waste turned into sustenance, and it kept the cattle industry moving north for 30 years. Number 17, pemmican. Long before European settlers crossed the plains, native peoples had perfected the ultimate survival food. Lean buffalo or deer meat was sliced thin, dried in the sun until brittle, then pounded into powder and mixed with rendered fat and sometimes dried berries. The result was pemmican, a dense, calorie-rich block that could sustain a person through the harshest winter. Mountain men and fur trappers adopted it without hesitation. A single pound contained roughly 3,500 calories, enough energy for a full day of hard travel. Packed into rawhide pouches, it lasted for months, even years, without spoiling. Lewis and Clark carried it on their expedition. The science was remarkably sound. The rendered fat sealed out moisture and bacteria, while the dried meat provided protein. Modern food scientists have confirmed that properly made pemmican remains nutritionally stable far longer than almost any processed food on supermarket shelves today. Pioneers heading west tucked pemmican into their packs, knowing that when the flour was gone and the game had moved on, this ancient recipe would keep them walking. Number 16. Vinegar pie. When lemons cost a fortune and fresh fruit was a distant memory, pioneer women in the Midwest performed a small miracle. They made pie from vinegar. A splash of apple cider vinegar, a few eggs, sugar, butter, and a pinch of nutmeg were whisked together and poured into a simple crust. Baked until set, the filling turned custardy and tangy, remarkably close to lemon meringue pie in both flavor and texture. Homesteaders on the Nebraska plains, 1,000 miles from the nearest citrus grove, could bake a dessert that tasted of something bright and almost luxurious. The vinegar provided the acid that lemon juice would have, while the eggs and butter smoothed it into something rich. A gallon of apple cider vinegar cost about 15 cents in the 1870s and lasted for months. That same gallon also cleaned wounds and preserved vegetables. Vinegar pie showed up at church socials, barn raisings, and Sunday tables across the Great Plains. Children ate it without ever guessing the secret ingredient. It was the kind of recipe that turned scarcity into celebration. Proof that a clever woman with a bare pantry could still set a table worth sitting down to. Number 15. Sowbelly and beans. The combination of salt pork and dried beans fueled more westward migration than any other single meal. Pioneers loaded barrels of salt-cured pork belly and sacks of navy beans onto their wagons, knowing that together these two ingredients would sustain them across months of hard travel. The pork was sliced thick, fried until the fat rendered and the edges crisped. Then the beans, soaked overnight, were simmered in that same grease with water and a little salt. The result was a heavy, salty, protein-rich stew that stuck to the ribs and kept bodies warm through freezing mountain passes. 100 pounds of salt pork cost about $8 in 1849. 50 pounds of dried beans cost $2. Together, they could feed a family of 5 for 3 months. Every mining camp, railroad crew, and cavalry outpost in the West ran on this combination. It was not elegant, but it was relentless in its ability to keep people alive. The men who built the Transcontinental Railroad ate Sowbelly and beans 6 days a week. The dish that built the frontier tasted like smoke, salt, and survival. Number 14, sourdough bread. First pattern break. Here is where the science gets remarkable. Every serious pioneer settlement west of the Rockies ran on sourdough. A woman would mix flour and water in a crock, capture wild yeast from the air, and within days have a living starter that could leaven bread indefinitely. That starter was treated like a family member. Women carried it inside their coats on freezing nights to keep it alive. Men slept with their starters during the Klondike Gold Rush, earning the nickname sourdough. The wild yeast and lactobacillus bacteria created a natural fermentation that did more than make bread rise. It broke down phytic acid in the flour, making minerals like iron and zinc more available to the body. It produced organic acids that acted as natural preservatives. Modern nutritional scientists have confirmed all of this. Sourdough fermentation actually increases the nutritional value of grain. A 25-pound sack of flour cost about $1 in 1860. With a healthy starter, a homesteader's wife could produce fresh bread every day for pennies. The starter itself cost nothing, just flour, water, and patience. San Francisco still bakes with starters descended from gold rush cultures over 170 years old. We replaced this with commercial yeast because it was faster, but faster was never better. Number 13, jerky. Drying meat in the open air was the frontier's original refrigerator. Hunters sliced venison, buffalo, or beef into thin strips, rubbed them with salt and sometimes pepper, and hung them over wooden racks in the sun and wind. Within days, the moisture was gone, and the meat had transformed into a lightweight, durable protein source that rode in saddlebags for weeks without spoiling. A single deer yielded enough jerky to feed a man for a month on the trail. The salt drew out moisture through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria could not survive. Native peoples had practiced this for centuries, and settlers adopted it immediately. Trappers packed it into the mountains. Soldiers carried it on forced marches. Families hung it from sod house rafters as insurance against a long winter. The cost was nothing but time and salt. Every westward expedition, from the fur trade to the California gold rush, moved on jerky. We buy it now in gas stations for $6 a bag, forgetting it was once made for free from the land itself. Number 12, corn pone. While Johnny Cake belonged to the trail, corn pone belonged to the cabin. Pioneer women in the South and across Appalachia shaped cornmeal dough into oval patties and baked them directly in the ashes of the hearth or in a greased iron skillet. No eggs, no milk, no wheat, just cornmeal, water, salt, and a little lard. The outside developed a thick golden crust while the inside stayed moist and crumbly. Corn pone was the daily bread of families who could not afford wheat flour, which cost 3 times as much as cornmeal in the rural South. Children ate it with pot liquor, the broth left from boiling greens. Fathers crumbled it into buttermilk for supper. Mothers baked a fresh batch every morning before dawn. Abraham Lincoln grew up on corn pone. So did most of the men who settled Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri. It was the foundation of frontier cooking in the American South, and it has almost entirely vanished from modern tables, replaced by cornbread recipes so loaded with sugar they would be unrecognizable to the women who fed a nation on nothing but corn and fire. Number 11, leather britches beans. Appalachian families could not afford to let a single green bean go to waste. In late summer, women strung fresh green beans onto long threads using a needle, then hung those strings from the cabin rafters or porch ceiling. The beans dried slowly in the warm air, shriveling into tough brown pods that looked like scraps of old leather. Come winter, a woman would pull down a string, snap the dried beans into a pot, and simmer them for hours with a piece of salt pork until they turned tender and rich. The slow rehydration concentrated the flavor into something far deeper than fresh beans ever delivered. Dried this way, beans lasted all winter without canning, without a root cellar, just thread and patience. Families in the Smoky Mountains kept this tradition alive into the 20th century. But as commercial canning took over, leather britches vanished from American kitchens along with the deep, smoky flavor that hours of slow cooking pulled from those wrinkled pods. Number 10, red-eye gravy. Second pattern break. This is the recipe that shows just how resourceful frontier cooking really was. After frying a thick slice of country ham in a cast iron skillet, the cook would pour black coffee directly into the hot pan. The coffee hit the smoking fat and the ham drippings, sizzling and scraping up every browned bit stuck to the iron. The result was a thin, intensely flavored sauce that was part gravy, part broth, and entirely unlike anything in modern cooking. The name came from the reddish eye of fat that floated in the center of the plate. Poured over grits or sopped up with biscuits, red-eye gravy turned a simple breakfast into something that could carry a man through 12 hours of splitting rails. The chemistry was accidental genius. The coffee's acid cut through the salt and fat of the ham, while the Maillard compounds added depth that butter gravy could never match. A cup of coffee cost almost nothing. The ham was already cooked. The gravy was essentially free. It fed Appalachian and Southern families for over a century. And food scientists say the interaction between coffee acids and rendered pork fat creates flavor compounds that cannot be replicated by any other method. Yet it has all but disappeared from American breakfast tables, replaced by sausage gravy made with flour and cream. Number 9. Spotted pup. Rice and raisins simmered together became the dessert that children on the frontier actually looked forward to. Women cooked rice in milk or water, stirred in a handful of raisins, a spoonful of sugar, and sometimes a dusting of cinnamon. The raisins plumped and darkened among the white rice, giving the dish its playful name. In mining camps and homesteads where fresh fruit was impossible and sugar was precious, spotted pup was a celebration. A pound of rice cost about 5 cents in the 1870s. Raisins, dried in the California sun, traveled well and lasted for months. Together they made a dessert that cost almost nothing but felt like a reward. Cowboys ate it straight from the Dutch oven. Children scraped the pot. Mothers served it warm on cold nights or cold on hot afternoons. It required no oven, no eggs, no butter. Spotted pup has vanished so completely that most people have never heard the name. But for the generation that built the West, it was the taste of sweetness when sweetness was hardest to come by. Number 8. Ash cakes. Before iron skillets became common on the frontier, the earliest settlers cooked cornmeal directly in the embers. A woman would mix cornmeal with water and a pinch of salt, shape the dough into flat cakes, wrap them in damp cabbage leaves or corn husks, and bury them in the hot ashes of the fire. 15 minutes later, she would rake them out, brush off the ash, and serve a bread with a charred, smoky crust and a soft, steaming center. The cabbage leaf protected the dough while allowing heat to penetrate evenly. It was cooking at its most elemental. No pan, no oven, no equipment of any kind, just fire and grain. Settlers moving through the Cumberland Gap cooked ash cakes every night on the trail. Daniel Boone's company reportedly lived on them for weeks. The taste was earthy and mineral, nothing like the sanitized cornbread of today. The cost was negligible, the method was ancient, and it worked everywhere. A fire could be built and corn could be carried. Number 7. Burgoo, third pattern break. Here is the recipe the military copied. Burgoo was the communal stew of the Kentucky frontier, a massive pot filled with whatever meat and vegetables were available. Squirrel, rabbit, venison, even bear meat went in alongside corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and beans. The pot simmered for an entire day, sometimes two, stirred with a wooden paddle, feeding dozens of people at a time. The Kentucky militia made burgoo their official field ration during frontier conflicts. A single pot could feed 50 men from ingredients that cost almost nothing because the meat was hunted and the vegetables were homegrown. The long cooking broke down tough game meat into something tender and rich. Burgoo masters became local celebrities. Towns held competitions. The recipe was never written down because it was never the same twice. It depended on what the land provided. That improvisation was the heart of frontier cooking. Modern barbecue festivals in Kentucky still serve burgoo, but the squirrel and wild game have been replaced with beef and mutton. The original, the one that fed the frontier, is gone. Number 6, fried salt pork and milk gravy. When the pantry held nothing but a slab of salt pork and a cup of flour, a frontier woman could still put a hot meal on the table. She sliced the pork thin, soaked it to draw out the heaviest salt, then fried it crisp in its own fat. Into that hot grease, she stirred flour, browning it golden, then slowly added milk or water, whisking until a thick white gravy formed. Spooned over biscuits or cornbread, the gravy was rich, salty, and filling enough to silence a hungry family. Salt pork cost about 6 cents a pound in the 1860s. Flour was cheap. Milk came from the family cow. The entire meal cost pennies and could be made in 15 minutes. Families in sod houses on the Nebraska plains ate this 3 or 4 times a week. It was survival cooking stripped to its bones. The gravy itself became the ancestor of the cream gravy that still shows up in southern diners, though today's version uses sausage instead of salt pork and has forgotten the desperate economy that created it. Number 5. Ramps and wild greens. Every spring before the garden produced and before the supply wagon arrived, pioneer families survived on what grew wild. Ramps, the pungent wild leeks that carpeted Appalachian forest floors, were the first green food to appear after months of salt pork and dried beans. Women dug them by the basketful, frying them in bacon grease or scrambling them into eggs. The sharp garlic smell clung to clothes for days, but nobody cared because ramps meant winter was over. Alongside ramps, women gathered poke salad, dandelion greens, and lamb's quarters, boiling them to remove bitterness and serving them with cornbread. These wild greens provided vitamins that the winter diet completely lacked. Families who did not forage in spring risked scurvy. A basket of ramps cost nothing but the labor of digging. They could not be cultivated, could not be stored, and could not be bought at any price outside their short season. For 3 or 4 weeks each year, the forest fed the frontier. Modern foragers now pay $20 a pound for ramps at farmers markets, treating as a luxury what pioneer families once depended on for survival. Number 4. Dutch oven cobblers. The cast iron Dutch oven was the single most important piece of cooking equipment on the frontier, and the cobbler was its crowning achievement. A woman would stew whatever fruit was available: wild blackberries, dried apples, peaches traded at a crossroads store, and top it with a simple biscuit dough made from flour, lard, and buttermilk. The Dutch oven was set over coals with more coals heaped on the lid, creating an oven within an oven that baked the topping golden while the fruit bubbled underneath. At barn raisings and camp meetings, a good Dutch oven cobbler drew more compliments than the preaching. Dried apples cost about 4 cents a pound. Fresh wild berries were free. The biscuit topping required ingredients every kitchen already had. For the cost of almost nothing, a woman could produce a dessert that made children cheer and men go quiet with satisfaction. The Dutch oven cobbler was the frontier's answer to the European tart, made without a proper kitchen, without a baking sheet, without anything except fire and iron and the stubborn refusal to let hardship steal every pleasure. Number 3. Putting down meat in lard. Fourth pattern break. Here is the preservation method that modern science cannot beat. Before refrigeration, pioneer women preserved cooked pork, sausage, and sometimes fried chicken by packing it into stoneware crocks and covering it completely with melted lard. As the lard cooled and solidified, it created an airtight seal that locked out bacteria, moisture, and air. Meat stored this way in a cool root cellar lasted for months, sometimes an entire winter. The fat acted as a natural barrier, superior in many ways to vacuum-sealed plastic because it maintained moisture content while preventing oxidation. A family that slaughtered a hog in November could eat from that crock through March. The lard itself was used for cooking as each piece was retrieved, so nothing was wasted. Food preservation scientists have confirmed that properly rendered lard creates a nearly perfect anaerobic seal. The technique predated canning and required no equipment a homestead did not already have. When commercial refrigeration arrived, women abandoned their crocks overnight, but the method was never improved upon. It was simply made unnecessary. Number 2, biscuits and sorghum. If one meal defined the American frontier more than any other, it was a plate of hot biscuits split open and drizzled with thick amber sorghum molasses. Women made biscuits every single morning, cutting lard into flour with their fingers, adding buttermilk, patting the dough, and baking in a Dutch oven or cast iron skillet. The biscuits came out golden on top, tender and layered inside, steaming when pulled apart. Sorghum pressed from cane grown on the homestead and boiled down into syrup at a communal mill provided the sweetener that sugar could not. A gallon of sorghum cost about 25 cents in the 1870s, or nothing if you grew your own cane. It lasted all year. Biscuits and sorghum fed families from sunup to sundown. Children ate them for breakfast with butter. Fathers carried cold biscuits in their coat pockets to eat in the field. Mothers served them at every meal because they could be made in minutes from ingredients that never ran out. The combination provided the calories that built fence lines, plowed fields, and raised cabins. It was the daily bread of the American frontier, so common that nobody thought to write it down. And now it is nearly gone, replaced by toast and store-bought jam, neither of which can touch the flavor of a fresh biscuit split open over a cast-iron skillet, sorghum pooling in the crevices, steam rising into a cold morning kitchen. Number 1. Pot liquor and cornbread crowned the pioneer table as the meal that wasted nothing and sustained everything. After boiling a mess of greens, collards, turnip tops, cabbage, or whatever the garden offered, with a ham hock or a piece of salt pork, the cook saved every drop of the cooking liquid. That broth, dark green, rich with vitamins, minerals, and the smoky essence of pork, was pot liquor. It was served in bowls with crumbled cornbread, stirred directly in, or with a wedge of corn pone on the side for dunking. The greens went on the plate, the meat stretched across the week, and the liquor fed the soul. Nutritionally, pot liquor was a powerhouse. The vitamins from the greens leached into the broth during cooking, turning what looked like simple water into one of the most nutrient-dense foods on the frontier. Families that drank pot liquor avoided the vitamin deficiencies that plagued settlers who relied on meat and grain alone. A ham hock cost almost nothing. Greens grew in every garden. Cornmeal was the cheapest grain in America. The entire meal, enough to feed a family, could be made for a few pennies. Pot liquor and cornbread was democracy in a bowl, eaten by the poorest sharecropper and the richest planter alike. It required no special skill, no rare ingredients, and no equipment beyond a pot and a fire. It was the first meal cooked in a new cabin and the last served before a family moved on. For the millions who built the American frontier, pot liquor and cornbread was not just food, it was home. Try one this week. Make a Dutch oven cobbler. Fry up some corn pone. Bake a batch of biscuits and find some sorghum. Then tell me in the comments if your great-grandmother was just being old-fashioned or if she knew something the grocery store made us forget.